They didn't string her up to kill her. They didn't beat her to break her. They did something colder than either, because it let every respectable man in town keep his hands clean. While a woman discovered what suffering looks like when it becomes official policy, out on the Kansas plains where the sky stretches forever and the wind carries no secrets. Two fence posts stood like a declaration carved into the earth by men who believed the land answered to them. Rope pressed into timber, rope pressed into skin, and between those posts, pulled wide beyond any measure of mercy, a young woman was held there in the open air. Wrists bound low, ankles lashed high, her body surrendered entirely to the knots. Her dress carried the stains of road dust and resistance, and her eyes held that particular look that comes when a person has already counted every passing moment and accepted that no one is riding to help. The town called it a lesson. That was the word men reach for when they want distance from what they're actually doing. It was mid-morning when the rider came over the rise and saw everything laid out against the wheat-colored flatlands like a scene the world should have, refused to host. He pulled his horse up hard, not because the animal spooked, because something inside him did. He was the kind of man who had stopped inserting himself into other people's trouble. Trouble had already taken too much from him, but his eyes found the ropes. Then they found the way her hands trembled, the way a flame trembles when wind threatens to end it, and something old and hot moved through his chest. The particular anger that rises when you recognize cruelty being performed deliberately, not just committed carelessly. His name was Jed Rohr in Dodge City. People knew him as the rancher who kept to himself and only spoke when silence wasn't sufficient. They also knew he had buried a wife once and had never allowed the town to witness what that cost him. Jed was 49. All sun-darkened muscle and practiced restraint, a red bandana at his collar, a hat that shaded eyes that cataloged everything. He looked like a man constructed for hard labor, but it was his stillness that made people careful around him. 'Cause stillness like his meant he had learned the discipline of waiting. He didn't wait. Now. He dropped from the saddle and walked toward the posts, boots crushing dry grass, the wind working at the dangling ropes as if it wanted to finish what the men who tied them had started. Up close, the woman's breathing came in shallow, rapid pulls, every inhale forced to negotiate with pain before it arrived. Dust marked her face. A bruise had bloomed dark across her shoulder. And there was something else. Something you can't name until you've seen it enough times. The expression of someone who has been told their body no longer belongs to them, and is fighting to remember how to keep it anyway. She saw him and flinched. Not away from him. Toward the ropes. Toward the knots. Toward whatever came next. Please, she rasped. Don't. Jed stopped several feet from her. Close enough to act, far enough not to become another threat. He kept his hands where she could see them. That mattered. Out here, hands told the truth long before mouths got around to it. I'm not here to hurt you, he said, voice low and unhurried. I'm here to get you down. Her eyes squeezed shut for a moment, like belief was a currency she couldn't afford, and she was furious at herself for wanting to spend it. When they opened again, her voice came thin and frightened but strangely specific, like a warning earned the hard way. Don't. It still hurts there. Jed went still. Not because the words confused him, because he understood them completely. Pain like that lives deep in joints and tendons, in places that don't produce visible bruises. Pain like that lingers. Pain like that makes the next person's touch feel like a threat, even when it isn't. He adjusted his stance immediately, reading her posture, the strain across her shoulders, the trembling in her arms, the way her ribs fought every breath. All right, he said quietly. Tell me where. Shoulders, hips. She swallowed and nodded once. My shoulder, and my left side when I breathe. Jed moved closer, slow as sunrise. He reached for the knot at her right wrist, then paused and looked at her face first, not a question spoken aloud. A request for permission given through patience. She didn't nod. But she didn't pull back either. That was all he received, and all he needed. He drew a small blade, plain, clean, a working knife, and cut the rope in a way that didn't snap it loose. He eased it. He supported her weight with his forearm before the released tension could jerk her shoulder. That was what he did, and out here that was unthinkable. He treated her like a person while she was still in the middle of being made into an example. He worked each knot the same way, slow, deliberate, removing. The rope like it was something burning that might bite if handled, carelessly. When the final knot gave at her left ankle, her body let go all at once, and Jed moved in, catching her mid-fall without grabbing, without yanking, without adding panic on top of pain. Her breath caught sharply. Her hands clutched at his shirt like they had their own logic. Jed shifted his grip to exactly where she'd warned him, beneath her ribs, supporting her spine, keeping pressure away from her left side. "Easy," he said. "Easy now. I've got you." She shook, half from the heat, half from shock, half from the sheer disbelief of being held without being claimed. Her legs refused to cooperate. Her feet touched ground and immediately wanted to abandon it again. Jed guided her down carefully, to her knees first, then back until she could sit in the grass, leaning against one post like it was the last solid thing in the world. He looked around then, because things like this never happen in isolation. No riders, no shouting, no men standing proud beside their work. Just the posts, the slack rope ends, and a silence that felt too deliberate to be coincidence. The prairie was vast, but Jed felt eyes on him regardless. Towns had a way of watching without showing themselves. Curtains moving, porches occupied by men who stared at the road like it owed them something. The woman's voice came again. Quieter now. "They said nobody would cut me down," she whispered. "They said, you don't do that here." Jed's jaw tightened. "What's your name?" She hesitated as if names carried a price. Then, with a breath that trembled at the edges, she answered, "Mara Dorsey." Jed knew that name. Not like family, not like a friend. But he'd heard it spoken once in town, with the particular contempt men use for women who make them uncomfortable. Mara Dorsey was the school teacher who didn't laugh at crude humor. The woman who wrote letters on behalf of widows who couldn't. The one who asked too plainly why certain ranch boundaries kept moving on county maps. The one who had said, calm as a hymn standing in the general store, "A town that only protects the powerful isn't a town. It's a trap." Jed had been near the back when she said it. He remembered because the room went quiet the way it goes quiet when truth arrives somewhere it wasn't invited. "Mara," he said gently, "can you stand if I help you?" She tried. Pain crossed her face so fast it almost looked like defiance. She made it halfway before her left side stole her breath. Jed caught her again. "That's all right," he said. "We do this slow." "Don't take me to town," she whispered, urgent and desperate. They'll do it again." "They'll make it worse." Jed looked toward the faint line where Dodge City sat like a bruise pressed into the horizon. He hated town roads. He hated what towns made people become, but he also possessed something Mara didn't have right now. The power of witnesses, and the kind of man who ordered this wasn't afraid of the dark. He was afraid of daylight. "I'm taking you to a doctor," Jed said. "Not because I trust this town, I don't, but because you don't get to die slowly out here while they stay comfortable." Her eyes searched his face, hunting for the deception. "Why?" she breathed. "Why would you?" "Because I've been the person nobody came for," he said, and something old lived in his voice. "And I'm tired of living somewhere that makes that feel normal." He lifted her again, careful, precise, keeping his forearm beneath her knees, his other arm at her back, no pressure on her ribs. As he carried her toward his horse, the wind shifted and delivered a smell he didn't welcome. Cigar smoke and soap, town smell. The smell of a man who doesn't earn his living with his hands. A figure stood far down the road. A man watching. Not near enough to be accused. Not distant enough to be innocent. Jed didn't wave. Didn't call out. He kept moving and memorized that silhouette like an unpaid debt. He got Mara into the saddle and mounted behind her, holding her steady as they moved. She tensed at the contact but didn't resist. Trust doesn't arrive whole in people who have been hurt. It arrives in fragments. They rode toward Dodge City with the sun directly overhead and the prairie alive with grasshoppers and judgment. Mara kept her gaze fixed on the horizon. Like looking back might conjure the posts again. Jed felt her breathing against his arm and matched his pace to it. He didn't speak much because there are moments when conversation feels like stealing air from someone who needs it more. Still, she spoke once. Voice small and bitter. "You shouldn't have stopped." Jed kept his eyes forward. "I already did. They'll come for you. Let them." Mara exhaled a shaky breath that sounded like it wanted to become a laugh but had forgotten how. You don't understand. In Dodge City, pain is legal if it comes from the right hands, Jed's jaw set. Then we put those hands in daylight. As the town drew closer, Mara's body tightened like the sight of it was reaching out to take hold of her again. Dodge City didn't look like a place that harbored villains. That was always its advantage. It looked like a place where men bought flour and children chased dogs down the street and church bells made grand promises about decency. But the porch sitters were already turning their heads. The street quieted in that specific way. The way it quiets when everyone understands something ugly has occurred and no one wants to be the one to acknowledge it. Jed rode straight to Dr. Harlan Finch's office. Finch had a reputation for one particular quality. He could be bought to keep his mouth closed. But he couldn't be bought to lie with his hands. He treated what needed treating. That was what mattered. Inside, the room smelled of boiled cloth and sharp spirits. Finch's eyes moved across Mara's wrists, her shoulder, the way she guarded her ribs. He didn't ask questions the way curious men do. He asked them the way exhausted men do, men who have repaired too many sins and still wake up inside the same town. Sit here, Finch said. Mara hissed when he tested her shoulder. Jed stepped closer, not hovering, just present. Strained badly, Finch muttered. And bruised. Left side, you said. Mara nodded, teeth pressed together. Finch looked at Jed. Who did this? Jed's gaze stayed on Mara. Tell him if you want, he said quietly. Or don't, Mara swallowed. Then whispered, Silas Ketchum. Finch's hand paused, just a fraction. Jed felt the name settle like stone dropped in still water. Silas Ketchum wasn't a rancher. He was a businessman, which in Dodge City meant he owned other men's obligations and called it enterprise. He was the type who sat composed in church on Sunday and corrupted the world the remaining 6 days. Finch finished the bandaging, set Mara's shoulder as gently as he could, and shook his head. She needs days of rest, Jed breathed out once, slow. She'll get it at my place. Finch looked uneasy. Your place is outside town. Exactly. The door swung open before Finch could respond further. A deputy stepped in, badge bright, eyes hollow. And behind him, moving with the unhurried ease of a man who had never truly been told no by anyone with authority, came Silas Ketchum himself. Clean vest, polite expression, the perfect calm of a man whose comfort has never been seriously threatened. He looked at Mara on the examination table and sighed with the mild disappointment of someone who has discovered a stray animal in the parlor. There. You are, Silas said, soft and satisfied. We've been worried. Mara's body went rigid. Jed felt it immediately, like a wire pulled taut. Silas's gaze slid over to Jed, amused. Mr. Rohr, he said, as if they were old acquaintances. You've inserted yourself into a private matter. Jed didn't move. You staked her out like a carcass. That's not private. That's a message. Silas's smile widened. Messages are sometimes necessary. People forget where they belong. I don't belong to you. Mara's voice cracked. Silas glanced at her the way you glance at someone who has spoken out of turn, then returned his attention to Jed, tone still perfectly civil. Sheriff has paperwork. Order of detainment. She's been creating a disturbance. She's been speaking, Mara whispered. Silas lifted one shoulder. Same thing in a town that values order. The deputy cleared his throat. Mr. Rohr, you're to step aside. Jed didn't. He looked at Mara, saw her trembling, saw her holding herself intact through nothing but sheer will, and he made the decision that would unsettle Dodge City more deeply than a gunshot in a cathedral. He stepped forward, and he did not reach for a weapon. He reached for the blanket draped beside her and pulled it up around her shoulders, went with a gentleness that made the entire room feel suddenly aware of. Itself, she's coming with me, Jed said. Silas's smile vanished. Not into rage, into something colder, calculation. You don't get to decide that. Then arrest me. That moment, that was the truly unthinkable thing. Not cutting the rope. Not the confrontation that could have followed. The unthinkable was refusing to play the town's favorite game. Pretend you don't see it so you don't have to be accountable for it. Silas leaned in close enough that only Jed could hear him. You can walk away, he murmured. Go back to your quiet little ranch. Nobody has to remember you were ever here. Jed's eyes didn't leave Silas's face. That's the problem, he said softly. Everybody forgets. The deputy moved forward, reaching for Jed's arm. Finch drew a sharp breath like a man who wanted to object but was afraid of the cost. Then the office door opened again, and the entire room shifted. A man entered wearing travel dust and a coat cut better than most. His posture carried straightness that didn't come from vanity. It came from years of marching. He held authority without brandishing it, and when he spoke, his voice made even Silas's deputy reconsider his position. Put your hands down. All of you, Silas blinked, affronted. And who exactly? The man produced a badge. Federal U.S. Marshal Graham Holt. And I've been investigating why Dodge City keeps losing cattle on paper but never in the pasture. The air went entirely. Still, because paperwork mattered more than injuries in towns like this. Paperwork was what made wickedness look legitimate. Silas recovered first, smile returning like a snake easing back into shade. Marshal, this is all a misunderstanding. A rancher interfering in a woman tied to fence posts on public land. Holt's tone stayed mild. That made it sharper. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a declaration. Silas offered a careful laugh. She's been causing trouble. Holt's eyes moved to Mara's wrists, her braced shoulder, the tremor in her hands. Then back to Silas. Troublemakers usually write things down, Holt said. And I hear she's been recording county maps, brand ledgers, names. Silas's smile wavered, one blink too slow, one breath too shallow. Mara stared at Holt as if she couldn't determine whether he was real. Holt looked at her directly. Did you write it? Mara swallowed. And for the first time since Jed had found her bound to those posts, her voice sounded less like fear and more like iron. Yes, she said. I recorded where the boundary lines shifted. I wrote down who signed which documents. I wrote down which deputy always happened to be looking the other direction. Silas's jaw tightened visibly. Holt nodded once, as if that settled everything, then looked at the deputy. You, outside, now? The deputy hesitated, then complied, because federal authority restructures the arithmetic. Silas's voice sharpened. Marshal, you don't have jurisdiction over... Holt cut him off without raising his voice. I have jurisdiction over theft that crosses county lines. I have jurisdiction over fraud. And I have jurisdiction over men who use rope as a substitute for a courthouse. Silas's face went pale around the eyes. The polished exterior began its descent. He looked at Jed with something in his expression that wanted to be a promise of revenge without saying so. Jed met that look with something Silas was thoroughly unaccustomed to, a man who had already decided, somewhere deep and permanent, that fear wasn't going to be his compass anymore. Holt's gaze shifted to Jed. You cut her down. Jed nodded. Holt looked at Mara. You said it still hurt. There. Back to Jed. You listened? Jed's mouth tightened. Pain tells the truth. Holt exhaled slowly, like a man who has waited a long time for someone to finally do the decent thing in a place that punishes it. All right. Here's what happens now. She comes with me, protected. You come too. Not as a prisoner. As a witness, Silas snapped, sudden and sharp. Witness to what? Holt turned. His eyes went cold. To the end of your comfort, if the story ended there, it would have been clean. The West doesn't produce clean endings. It produces consequences that arrive late and stay a long while. Holt didn't march Silas to a cell immediately, because men like Silas were constructed entirely from loopholes. Instead, Holt did something more damaging than anger. He did paperwork. He asked questions. He worked in daylight. He placed Mara in a room above the courthouse under guard, not because Dodge City had suddenly become worthy of trust, but because trust wasn't the requirement. Vigilance was. Jed positioned himself near the building like a stubborn shadow. He hadn't been invited. He didn't concern himself with that. He watched men arrive and depart. Watched Silas's associates gather the way flies gather around something rotting. Watched the deputy's expression move between fear and indignation. All afternoon, Holt kept asking for one thing, proof. Mara had proof. Not visible on her body. Hidden somewhere people never thought to look, because Dodge City only searched for trouble when it was convenient. Holt asked her, gently but directly, where she had kept it. Mara's eyes moved to Jed, then away, then back, as if embarrassed that she had planned this with the rigor of a military campaign. Schoolhouse, she said, under the floorboard by the stove. Inside a tin, Holt nodded. We'll retrieve it. Silas's voice drifted down the corridor like a sermon performed by something cold-blooded. You'll find nothing but a woman's overactive imagination, Marshal. Holt didn't look up. Imagination doesn't produce rope burns. As the sun angled westward, Holt rode to the schoolhouse with 2 men. Jed accompanied them, because leaving Mara alone in that building felt identical to walking away from the fence posts all over again. The schoolhouse smelled of chalk and warm timber. Small desks, a blackboard with half-erased arithmetic. It looked innocent. That gave Jed a brief, sharp grief. How many decent things did a town like this step over without ever pausing to notice? Holt knelt beside the stove, pried up the board, and lifted out a tin. Inside were folded pages. Maps drawn with careful precision. Names recorded with the steadiness of someone who understood that what she was doing might one day be the only thing standing between justice and erasure. A catalog of brand marks that bore no resemblance to the county ledger. Jed watched Holt read, and saw the marshal's eyes harden in the particular way that signals a man has just been handed permission to stop being polite. This isn't just cattle, Holt said quietly. This is land, taxes, forged filings. Mara's voice was barely above a whisper. They shifted the boundary lines on paper, then declared the land had always been theirs. Jed felt his stomach pull tight. That was a theft that didn't require firearms. It only required a town too exhausted to keep checking. Holt tucked the papers into his coat as if they were living things. Who assisted him? Mara hesitated, not from ignorance, from understanding that speaking names aloud in Dodge City could get you erased without anyone firing a single shot. She swallowed. Deputy Lyle, Sheriff Turnbow, 3 ranch hands who move the cattle at night. One of them walks with a limp. Holt's focus sharpened. Where do they cross? South Bend, the Cottonwoods. Shallow water. They push the herd through at midnight and drive it hard toward Silver Creek before first light. Holt nodded once. They returned to the courthouse as the sky began its transformation into that bruised, burning pink the prairie wears at evening. The hallway felt different now. People stood farther apart. Voices dropped lower. The town could sense something shifting, and towns fear change more consistently than they fear wrongdoing. Holt called the sheriff into his office and shut the door. Jed stayed outside with Mara on a bench. Her shoulder wrapped, her hands still trembling occasionally, as if her nerves were the last thing to receive the message that the immediate crisis had passed. She stared at her own palms like she was relearning their ownership. After a sustained silence, she spoke. Almost to herself. I taught children to write their names, she said, and I believed that meant something. Jed didn't answer immediately, because he knew exactly what she meant. He had once believed that being a decent person functioned as a kind of armor. The West instructs you otherwise. It teaches you that decency is a choice, and sometimes it makes you a target. It still means something, he said finally. Just not to men like him? Mara's eyes lifted, tired and fierce in equal measure. Why did you actually stop? The question settled in his chest like something with weight. Jed looked out the window at the street. At men walking as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. At women with market baskets moving through a town that had left someone stretched between posts under an open sky. He could have offered something simple. He could have said it was the right thing to do. But Mara had been transformed into a lesson, and he refused to diminish her with comfortable words. Because once, Jed said, voice quiet. I didn't. Mara turned slightly, careful of her shoulder. Didn't what? Jed's throat moved. I didn't stop. I didn't speak. I didn't insert myself. A pause. My sister. Years back, she married a man the town called respectable. When the bruises started appearing, people said it wasn't their concern. I told myself the same thing. He swallowed. Then one winter, she came to my door and asked for help. I was exhausted. I was bitter from my own grief. I told her to go home and keep the peace until morning. His jaw set like stone. Morning came. She didn't. Mara's breath caught. Jed didn't look at her, because he didn't need comfort. He needed the truth somewhere outside himself, where it couldn't continue decaying in the dark. "So when I saw you," he said, "I couldn't let it be twice." Mara's eyes glistened. She looked away quickly, as though even tears were something Dodge City had taught her to conceal. "They'll come tonight," she whispered. "Silas won't wait for your marshal. He'll move before the evidence becomes a noose around his neck." Jed's gaze hardened. "Then we don't sleep." Holt emerged an hour later, expression like incoming weather. Sheriffs rattled. Deputies slippery. "I can't arrest half the town without a clean moment. Do it wrong and witnesses disappear. Papers burn. And Mara becomes an accident." He paused. "So we set a trap. South Bend, midnight. Mara's lips went pale. They'll kill me if they can." "Not tonight," Holt said. "Not with me present." Jed spoke without hesitation. "She comes to my ranch until then." Holt studied him, then nodded. "Take her. Keep her visible enough to seem ordinary, hidden enough to be safe. And Jed," a pause, "don't do anything heroic." Jed's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Out here, heroic just means in the way." They rode out at dusk, Mara in the saddle. Jed behind her. The town watching through its windows the way it watches weather it deserves. The prairie cooled as they moved. Stars appeared, bright, remote, entirely indifferent. Jed's ranch lay several miles out. A low cabin. A porch that had carried the weight of many solitary evenings. Inside, Jed lit the lamp and offered Mara water and bread. She ate with the careful restraint of someone not fully convinced they were permitted to. Afterward, she stood at the open door listening. "I hear hoofbeats in my head," she admitted, voice quiet, even when it's completely silent. Jed nodded. "That'll happen." He hesitated, then added, "If you need the door open, it stays open. If you need it shut, I'll shut it. You tell me." Mara looked at him as if the concept of being offered a choice was still foreign to her. "Open," she whispered. "I need to be able to see." He left it open. Night air moved through the cabin like something gentle. Beyond the porch, the pasture lay silver under moonlight, peaceful, serene. That was what made danger so effective out here. It had no obligation to announce itself. Hours moved slowly. Mara sat on the edge of the cot, shoulders taut. Jed sat at the table, rifle laid beside him, not raised, not theatrical, simply present. The lamp hissed softly. Wind nudged the porch boards. At some point, Mara's voice came again, barely a breath. "Did your sister have a name?" Jed's gaze lowered. "Nell?" Mara nodded, swallowing carefully. "I'll remember her." Jed said nothing, because gratitude is complicated when it arrives wearing grief as its coat. Then, just before midnight, the horses in the corral shifted and snorted. Jed's head lifted. Mara went rigid. The prairie went quiet in that specific way it goes. Quiet when something else is also listening. Jed rose and moved to the doorway without rushing, because rushing creates sound. He looked out, and in the moonlight he saw exactly what he had been expecting and still hated. Riders. 3 of them. Coming slow, tracking low ground, using the dip in the terrain to conceal their approach. Men who didn't want to be seen by the marshal positioned at the riverbank. Men who wanted to resolve their problem now. Far from paperwork and federal authority, Jed turned back to Mara and spoke at a volume that barely disturbed the air. "Under the bed, there's a panel in the floor. You go down. You don't come up until I say your name." Mara's eyes went wide. "I can't leave you up here." "You can," Jed said. "And you will." Her jaw trembled, but she moved. She lowered herself carefully, wincing as her ribs registered their objection, and slipped into the narrow space beneath the floorboards. Jed slid the panel back and replaced the rug with the precision of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. Then he stepped onto the porch. With the complete, steady calm of a man who has already decided what he will and will not allow on his own land. The riders stopped at the fence. One dismounted and walked forward. Even from the shadows, Jed identified the limp. "Evening, Roar. We're looking for a woman. She's gone missing." Jed kept his rifle resting against his shoulder like it had always lived there. "You're on my land." "State your business plainly," the man smiled. "Simple matter. She's wanted." The marshal doesn't fully understand what he's walked into. "Hand her over, and you go back to being invisible." "I'm not invisible," Jed said. I'm just quiet. The man's smile tightened. Quiet men live longer. Not tonight, Jed replied. The riders exchanged glances. One shifted in the saddle, impatient. The limping man stepped closer. You cut her down. That wasn't your place. Jed's voice stayed level. And tying her up was? Don't get righteous. You don't know her. I know what rope means. The man took one step, then another, pushing the boundary. He wanted Jed to raise his rifle first. He wanted a reason. That is what men like him always want. Permission dressed as self-defense. Jed didn't provide it. Instead, quietly as the prairie itself, he said, "Turn around." The limping man laughed. Or what? Jed held his gaze. Or you'll learn what it feels like when someone finally says no. Silence extended. The moonlight made everything appear clean. That almost made it crueler. The limping man spat into the grass. Nodded once to the rider behind him. A signal. The second rider dropped from his horse and began circling wide, angling toward the side of the cabin, toward the window. Jed shifted one step, closing off the angle without theatrics. The limping man saw it and smiled like he'd been waiting for exactly that. That's your problem. Roar. You started caring. Get off my land. The man's hand drifted toward his holster. Not a grab, a drift. A threat dressed as instinct. Jed raised his rifle just enough to draw a line in the air. Don't, the limping man paused, measured the older rancher, and arrived at the conclusion men like him despise arriving at, that Jed wasn't bluffing, but he also wasn't eager. That meant Jed would fire only if compelled. And compulsion was precisely their plan, because they needed silence more than they needed pride. Then the third rider, the one who had remained near the road, whistled low. A signal. More hoofbeats from behind the rise. Additional riders, circling to box the cabin. Mara, beneath the floor, would hear them too. Jed kept his expression neutral, but his thinking moved quickly. Hold position here, and the cabin becomes a cage. Retreat, and they pursue. Fire, and it becomes open warfare. So he did the one thing that strips the advantage from men like these. He changed the shape of the problem. He stepped backward off the porch, slowly, rifle still trained, toward the corral gate, toward the open pasture, toward space. You want me, Jed said. Come and take me. He moved sideways. Then he fired once, not at anyone's head. Not for drama, into the dirt near the limping man's boots. The shot kicked up a plume of dust like a signal flare. The man jumped back, cursing. The riders swore and drew their weapons. Jed didn't wait to trade shots on a porch. He swung up onto his horse in one practiced motion and rode hard into the pasture, pulling the conflict away from the cabin, away from the floorboard concealing Mara's held breath. The riders gave chase. Exactly as he'd needed. Hooves hammered the ground. Wind tore past his bandana. Behind him, gunshots cracked, wild and angry, intended to frighten more than wound. Jed didn't look back. He knew this land. He knew where the prairie dog holes were, where the creek cut beneath the grass, where a horse could run flat and where it would stumble. He directed them toward the low draw that bisected his pasture like an old wound. At the last moment, he veered aside. The first pursuing rider, moving too fast, too eagerly, hit the soft embankment and nearly went down. The horse recovered, but momentum shattered. The rider cursed. Jed used that moment to open distance. He rode straight for the line of cottonwood trees marking the river route. Because if Holt was positioned at South Bend, then the best direction for these men to travel, once panicked, was straight into Federal Lantern Light. The chase swept across the prairie like a moving storm. Jed could hear the riders straining behind him, felt their frustration escalating, felt them realizing they were no longer hunting a frightened schoolteacher. They were hunting a rancher who knew every contour of the ground beneath their horses' hooves. The limping man shouted, voice shredded by wind, "You can't win this, Roar!" Jed didn't respond. The land responded for him, with its dips and ridges and honest distance. As the cottonwoods neared, Lantern Light appeared ahead. Dim, steady, controlled. Holt, Jed angled toward it. The riders behind him, blinded by anger and moonlit shadow, followed without thinking. Then Holt's voice cut through the night like cold. "Iron, stop where you are. U.S. Marshal, the Lanterns flared brighter as men stepped from between the trees with rifles shouldered. The riders slammed on their reins. Horses skidded, snorting. The limping man attempted to wheel around, but Holt's men had already spread wide, closing the gap with the unhurried precision of people who had rehearsed this. Holt stepped forward, calm as a balanced ledger. Hands where I can see them. The limping man's eyes moved in rapid calculation. That was his final miscalculation. Holt's rifle did not waver. I said hands, quieter. Somehow worse. The limping man raised his palms. The others followed, because whatever loyalty they carried wasn't worth federal imprisonment. Holt's men moved in and disarmed them efficiently. Holt's gaze found Jed. You all right? Jed nodded, still breathing hard. They came for her. Holt's jaw tightened. Of course they did. He looked at the limping man. Name, the man spat. Ain't your concern. Holt nodded as if that answer were itself a gift. It is now. When they searched the limping man, they found a folded note inside his vest. Holt read it by lantern light. His expression barely shifted, but his eyes did, growing several degrees colder. A note from Silas Ketchum, Holt said quietly. He looked up at the limping man. Instructs you to retrieve Mara Dorsey before dawn. Says he'll handle the marshal afterward. A pause. That's useful. The limping man's color drained. He glanced toward the dark as if Silas might be watching from somewhere. And for the first time, wore the expression of a man who has just understood he was never anything but a tool. Bring them all in, Holt said. Jed didn't delay. He turned his horse and rode back for the cabin, heart working hard, not from fear for himself, but from the image of Mara alone beneath the floorboard, listening to hoofbeats and rifle fire in the dark. When he stepped back inside, the door still hung open where he'd left it. He knelt and lifted the rug. Then the panel, Mara's face appeared below, pale, drawn tight with terror that hadn't yet been given permission to release. Her eyes found his, and she exhaled a breath that sounded like it had been imprisoned for hours. Jed, she whispered. Come on, he said gently. It's safe, she climbed out trembling. When she stood, she swayed, and Jed steadied her, careful of her ribs. I thought they'd burn the cabin, she said, voice unsteady. Jed's throat tightened. Not tonight. Mara looked at his face, and in her eyes was something new, something resembling a person beginning, cautiously to believe in her own survival. You didn't look away, she said, as if still processing that this was real. Jed shook his head once. Never again. Dawn arrived over Dodge City with a strange and fragile quiet. The kind that isn't peace. The kind that is anticipation. Holt didn't wait for the town to arrange itself into excuses. He walked into the sheriff's office with the note in his coat pocket and Mara's tin of documents under his arm, and he asked the sheriff to account for the brand records. The sheriff attempted a smile. Attempted friendliness. Holt didn't allow it. When the sheriff's answers began to dissolve into stammering, Holt brought in the limping man in cuffs and positioned him in a chair, within the sheriff's direct line of sight. The sheriff's face changed, subtly. The expression of a man watching the game moved beyond his management. Holt read names aloud, payments, forged documents, boundary alterations, and then finally the words that make a dishonest town's stomach drop to its boots. This is federal. By mid-morning, Silas Ketchum was no longer moving down the boardwalk like a man who owned the air he breathed. He stood on the courthouse steps with his vest wrinkled and his smile absent, eyes moving across the gathered crowd in search of reassurance that wasn't arriving. People came because people always gather when power falls. It's as reliable as gravity. Holt didn't preach. He didn't make threats. He simply held the papers and read the truth aloud the way you announce weather. Plainly, without apology. He named the deputy. He named the sheriff. He named Silas. And Dodge City had to listen, because the truth now carried a badge with more authority than their local shame. Silas tried once more. Voice sharpened with something close to panic. You can't prosecute a man on a schoolteacher's scribbles. Mara stepped forward beside Holt, shoulder wrapped, ribs aching, spine straight. Her voice didn't shout. It simply carried. They weren't scribbles, she said. They were the town you helped steal. Silas's face twisted. For a moment, his old composure flared like a dying match. "Look at her," he called to the crowd. "You want a woman like that determining your laws? Teaching your daughters to defy their husbands?" The crowd stirred. Old instincts, old rot. Jed felt anger move through him, but Holt spoke first, with the measured delivery of someone who has no interest in raising his voice. "This isn't about husbands. This is about theft, fraud, assault, and conspiracy." A pause, each word placed deliberately, and about a town that believed it could conceal violence behind paperwork. Silas's shoulders dropped, barely perceptibly. Just a fraction. Just enough. That was when Jed understood something essential. Silas wasn't brave. He was comfortable. And comfort is always the first casualty when genuine daylight arrives. Holt nodded to his men. They moved in, placed Silas in cuffs, and walked him down the courthouse steps. Silas looked around, searching the faces in the crowd with something that wanted to be dignity, but had become desperation. Nobody stepped forward. Not out of sudden virtue, out of sudden visibility, the fear of being associated with a man whose protection had expired. In Dodge City, that was the beginning of change. Not morality, accountability. Jed stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, hat pulled low, and felt Mara's shoulder brush his arm. She spoke without looking at him. "They'll say you did it for me," she murmured. "They'll make it something small and ugly." Jed's voice stayed quiet. "Let them talk," Mara swallowed. "I don't know what I am now." Jed looked out past the town at the prairie. "Wide and honest and demanding. You're alive," he said. "That's a beginning." They left Dodge City before the day could turn cruel again. Holt rode part way with them, because even arrested men have people who care about them for the wrong reasons. And those people carry grudges. At the edge of the flats, Holt pulled his horse up and studied Jed and Mara with the expression of a man trying to determine whether something decent has a reasonable chance of surviving in difficult country. "I'll return," Holt said. "There will be hearings, depositions. It won't be resolved quickly." Mara nodded, exhausted but upright. "I'll testify." Holt's expression shifted into something that looked close to respect. He looked at Jed. "Keep her safe." "I will." Holt tipped his hat and rode back toward town, toward the work that doesn't end. Jed and Mara rode toward the ranch, toward quiet. The prairie wind moved past them with more gentleness than it usually offered. On the porch that evening, Mara sat with a cup of coffee warming her hands. Her shoulder still ached. Her ribs still complained. Pain doesn't disappear simply because justice shows up. But when she breathed, the air no longer felt like it had been rationed by someone else. She watched the sun dissolve into orange along the horizon. Then she spoke, voice soft as the light. "When I was on those posts," she said, "I kept thinking, maybe the worst part isn't the pain. The worst part is that nobody has to touch you for you to be destroyed. They only have to agree that you deserve it." Jed leaned back against the wall, hat off. Hair moved by the evening wind, he nodded slowly. "That's how towns rot," he said. Quiet agreement. Mara's fingers pressed around the cup. "And you broke it." Jed didn't answer immediately. He didn't want to describe what he'd done as something clean. He'd done it shaking. He'd done it angry. He'd done it because an old, deep regret had finally outweighed his fear. That wasn't heroism. That was being human at the last possible second, and knowing it. "I just stopped," he said. "That's all." Mara looked at him, eyes catching the lamplight. "Sometimes," she said, "that's everything." The porch boards shifted with the settling night. A horse moved in the yard. Darkness arrived softly. Mara rested her head back against the post, careful of her shoulder, and exhaled. "It still hurts there," she admitted, almost shy about it. Jed's voice came quiet and steady. "The way you speak to someone you refuse to rush. Then we keep listening to it," he said, "until it doesn't." And in that small, plain sentence was the one thing Dodge City had never given her. Not punishment time. Healing time. The kind that doesn't demand you perform courage every single moment. Only honesty. Mara closed her eyes. For the first time in what felt like a very long while, the silence around her didn't feel like a threat. It felt like space. And out on the prairie, beneath a sky that had never once pretended otherwise, a woman who had been made into a warning began the slow, necessary work of becoming herself again. While a rancher who had spent years in retreat from his own regret finally learned something the West rarely admits: that the hardest thing isn't surviving the gunfire, it's choosing not to look away when the rope is already tied.